Welcome to Survival Horror Ambience. Las Vegas may be known for its bright lights and never-ending nightlife, but when the neon glow fades and the streets grow quiet, a different side of the city emerges. A world of strange encounters, eerie figures, and unexplainable events lurks in the shadows, seen only by those who work the graveyard shift. This collection of terrifying stories comes from gas station clerks, security guards, late-night workers, and unlucky travelers who have witnessed something they were never meant to see. Some of these stories will make your skin crawl. Others will make you question what truly hides in the dark. Lock your doors, keep the lights on, and listen closely. Because in Las Vegas, the night never sleeps, but sometimes something else is awake with you. I'll never forget the guy I met at the gas station late at night. Hey everyone, I'm posting this because I've been haunted by this memory for years and just need to share it. This happened about 4 years ago, and I still can't shake the feeling of what happened. I was driving back from a weekend trip to visit my family. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., and I had about an hour left to go. I was on a stretch of highway with very little around, just woods and the occasional farmhouse. My car was running low on gas, so I decided to stop at the one gas station that was open 24/7. It looked old and a little rundown, but I didn't think much of it at the time. When I pulled up to the pump, I noticed there was a guy standing outside the station, near the door. He was just standing there, looking out into the dark. He had a scruffy beard and was wearing a worn-out jacket. He didn't seem to be doing anything, not pumping gas, not moving at all, just staring into the night. I wasn't exactly scared yet, but something felt off. I've always been a little on edge late at night, so I decided to fill up quickly and get on my way. As I pumped gas, I noticed a man slowly walking toward me. His movements were strange, like he was either lost in thought or unsure of where he was going. He stopped just a foot away from me, saying nothing at first. I figured he was about to ask for a ride or some change, but instead he just stared. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was an emptiness in them, like he hadn't slept in days. Finally, he spoke. "I saw you pull in. You know you shouldn't be here. Not at this hour." I let out a small, uneasy laugh and said something like, "Yeah, just need to get home." But he didn't smile. He didn't react at all. Instead, he took a step closer, and a chill ran down my spine. "Not good to be alone out here," he muttered, his voice flat, distant. Not good at all. Whether he was trying to warn me or scare me, I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I hurried to finish at the pump, locked my car, and started to climb in. But before I could close the door, his hand shot out and grabbed my arm. "I'll see you again," he said, his grip unnervingly cold. I yanked away, slammed my door shut, and sped off without looking back. I didn't stop driving until I reached a larger town an hour later. When I glanced around, he was nowhere in sight. I never saw him again. I don't know what he wanted or why he said what he did, but I've avoided that gas station at night ever since. And I don't plan on ever going back. To the man from that night, I hope our paths never cross again. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where nothing ever really happens. It's not too far from the city, but at night, it feels isolated. Just rows of houses, the occasional streetlight, and a whole lot of silence. I have a habit of taking late-night walks when I can't sleep. I know it's not the safest thing in the world, but my neighborhood has always felt peaceful, almost boring. Besides, I usually stick to the same route, a few blocks around my street, a short detour past the park, and back home. Simple. That night, I left my house around 1:30 a.m. It was colder than usual, and the streets were unusually empty. No cars, no people, just me and the distant hum of the highway. I put in my earbuds but kept the volume low. I like being aware of my surroundings, just in case. I was about 10 minutes into my walk when I noticed him. A man, about half a block behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. People walk at night, right? Maybe he couldn't sleep either. But something about him felt off. He wasn't just walking. He was matching my pace exactly. I slowed down. He slowed down. He slowed down. I sped up. At one point, I stopped completely and pretended to check my phone. For a second, I hoped I was just imagining things. But when I turned my head slightly, I saw him standing there, perfectly still, just watching me from a distance. That was enough for me. I turned down a different street, one I usually don't take, just to see if he'd keep following. And he did. By now, my heart was racing. I considered turning back toward my house, but something in my gut told me not to. I didn't want him knowing where I lived. Instead, I picked up my pace and walked toward the park. There was a small cut-through that led to another street, and I figured I could lose him there. The whole time, I could hear his footsteps behind me, never running, never stopping. just keeping pace. The park. I took one last glance behind me. He was gone. I stopped walking, confused. There was no way he could have disappeared that quickly. There were no side streets, no alleys, nowhere to hide. It was like he had just vanished. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Then I heard something, a soft rustling sound, coming from the trees. I turned toward the noise, my stomach twisting into knots. The park was dark, but I could just barely make out something between the trees. A shape, a figure. And then, I swear on my life, it started crawling toward me. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. The figure in the trees wasn't walking toward me. It was crawling, fast, low to the ground, moving in an unnatural, jerky way. The worst part? It didn't make a sound. No footsteps, no breathing. Just that awful, rustling noise as its hands and feet scraped against the dirt. I took a shaky step back. My body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. It wasn't the man from earlier. At least, I didn't think so. The shape was all wrong. The limbs were too long. The posture was wrong. Then it stopped, right at the tree line. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my whole body rigid with fear. Then, in one swift motion, the figure rose. It stood up. And that's when I realized something that made my stomach drop. It was the man from before, but something about him had changed. His posture was unnatural. His neck tilted at an angle that made my skin crawl. His arms hung limply at his sides, too long, too thin. And his face. God, his face. I couldn't see his eyes in the dark, but I could feel them on me, watching, waiting. Then, without warning, he took a step forward. That was it. That was all I needed. My body finally kicked into survival mode, and I turned and ran. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. I sprinted through the park, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I could hear him behind me, not running, but moving. His footsteps too light, too controlled. I took the fastest route I could think of, cutting through back streets and alleys, zigzagging between houses, hoping, praying, that he wasn't still behind me. By the time I reached my street, my legs were shaking. I forced myself to slow down, glancing behind me one last time. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Just the empty road and the quiet hum of the streetlights. I practically threw myself inside my house, locking every door, checking every window. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch, listening, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The next morning I convinced myself I had imagined most of it. Sleep deprivation? A trick of the dark? Maybe I just freaked myself out. At least, that's what I tried to believe. Until I checked my phone. There was a notification. A missed alert from my doorbell camera. Motion detected. At 2:47 a.m., my stomach dropped. With shaky hands, I opened the footage. At first, I didn't see anything. The street was empty. My porch was empty. Just the dim glow of the streetlight. Then, at the very edge of the frame, just before the camera cut off, I saw something. A shadow, tall, still, standing just beyond the streetlight, watching my house, and I swear before the video ended, it took a step forward. It happened back in the mid-90s when my older brother and I were still teenagers. I was about 17 at the time, and my brother, Jamal, was 19. We'd spent the day driving through some pretty rural parts of the Midwest, taking a road trip to visit some distant relatives. The trip was supposed to be fun, a way to escape the city and spend time together. But it quickly turned into something neither of us will ever forget. We were coming up on sunset, and as we passed through small towns with names we couldn't even pronounce, we noticed the landscape becoming more isolated. It was the kind of place where everything felt empty. There weren't many people out, no one on the sidewalks or even cars on the streets. It felt like time was moving slower. Jamal was driving our old family car, a beat-up sedan. We were on a stretch of highway with barely any streetlights, and I remember the glow of the dashboard lights making everything feel even more secluded. We were used to city living, always surrounded by people, so the silence of the small towns felt odd. We didn't know the area well, but we figured we'd be out of it soon. That's when we came upon a small town that didn't look like much, just a couple of rundown buildings and some homes with broken fences. I don't even remember the name of the town. I think it was one of those forgotten places that no one really talks about. We were getting low on gas, so we pulled into a tiny, dimly lit gas station. There was only one other car there, an old pickup truck that seemed out of place. As we stepped out, I noticed the truck's driver watching us. He had a look on his face that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't hostility, but it wasn't welcoming either. Thought it was weird. But Jamal and I were focused on getting the gas and moving on. We figured we'd just fill up and leave as quickly as possible. But then, as I stepped into the store to pay, I felt this uncomfortable tension in the air. The cashier, an older man, didn't make eye contact when I walked up to the counter. He simply took my cash and handed me my change with no words. "Anything else?" he asked, his voice flat. I shook my head, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to hurry up and leave. As I turned to head back out to the car, I noticed something strange. The other customers at the gas station, two older men standing near the door, were staring at us. They didn't make any attempt to look away, and their eyes seemed cold. Jamal was already getting back into the car when I walked outside, but before I could get to the driver's side, one of the men from the station came out. He was holding a can of beer in his hand and looked straight at me. "You'll need to keep moving," he said, his tone suddenly harsh. I froze. I didn't know what to say. His voice had that edge, like it was a warning more than anything. I glanced at Jamal, who was already looking at me, his face tense. Without a word, I got into the car, and we drove off quickly, both of us feeling the change in the air. We didn't talk much as we drove out of town, but there was a heavy silence between us. It wasn't until we reached the end of the road that I glanced back at the gas station and saw the two men standing at the door, still watching us. That's when I started to feel the creeping dread. Something wasn't right. It wasn't until we reached the outskirts of the town that Jamal spoke up. "I don't know, man," he said, his voice low. "That felt wrong. Did you see the way they looked at us?" I nodded. "Yeah, it was like we were..." They looked at us. I nodded. "Yeah, it was like we were not supposed to be there." At that moment, I realized we might have ended up somewhere we weren't meant to be. But I had no idea just how dangerous that realization would be. As we kept driving, the uneasy feeling didn't go away. The road had become even more desolate, with no street lights or other cars in sight. The atmosphere seemed to grow thicker the further we got from that gas station. It was dark, and the last remnants of sunlight had disappeared, leaving nothing but the headlights cutting through the night. Jamal was quiet for a while, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. Something about that town wasn't right. But we didn't say anything at first. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge how unsettled we both were. It didn't feel like just a weird encounter. It felt like a warning. After a while, Jamal broke the silence. "I think we might have just been in a sundown town." I turned to him, not sure if I heard him right. "A sundown town? What are you talking about?" He looked over at me, his face serious. "You've heard of those, right? Places where..." I cut him off. "Yeah, I know what they are. But I don't think that was what we were in. I mean, no one said anything outright. We could have just been imagining things. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. A sundown town, for anyone who doesn't know, is a place where, historically, African Americans, people like us, were not welcome after sundown. It wasn't always spoken openly, but the message was clear. Get out before dark, or else. As Jamal kept driving, the silence between us grew heavier. We kept going through that empty road, no signs of life anywhere. There were no towns for miles, and we were getting more and more anxious. That's when it happened. We were approaching a bend in the road when a set of headlights appeared behind us. At first, I figured it was just another car catching up, but as the lights grew brighter, a sinking feeling settled in. It wasn't just any car. It wasn't just any car. It was the truck from the gas station, the same one driven by the man who had warned us. My pulse quickened. I glanced at Jamal, and from the look in his eyes, I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. The truck wasn't just following us. It was tailing us. Close. Too close. The headlights filled the rearview mirror, making it impossible to see much beyond the glare. My chest tightened with unease. "Should I pull over?" Jamal asked, gripping the wheel. "No," I said quickly. "Just keep driving." The truck's engine growled behind us, the sound growing louder. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I fought the urge to reach for the door handle, just in case. Jamal's hands tensed on the wheel. "It's like he's trying to box us in," he muttered, pressing the gas pedal harder. The car lurched forward, the tires gripping the winding road as we picked up speed. But the truck stayed right there, matching us, refusing to fall back. The chase went on longer than I could process. Minutes stretched endlessly, each second heavier than the last. The road ahead was empty, swallowed by the dark. Just us and the truck, and it wasn't going away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw headlights in the distance. A car, another car. At first, I thought it was just a mirage, but it was real. The truck saw the headlights too, and that's when it suddenly backed off. Jamal slowed down as we passed the car, but the truck stayed behind. I watched as it turned off the main road and drove off into a side path, disappearing into the night. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, and I was trying to catch my breath. I turned to Jamal, my voice shaking. What the hell just happened? Jamal was white-knuckling the wheel, eyes wide. I don't know. But that guy was chasing us. He was trying to run us off the road. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The fear was mutual. We both knew what had just happened, even if we didn't fully understand it. We had narrowly escaped something dark and dangerous. We didn't speak much after that, and as we finally got to the nearest town, we didn't waste any time getting gas or stopping. We didn't even look back. I don't know what the guy's intentions were that night. Maybe he thought we were someone else. Maybe it was something more sinister. Either way, I still think about it every now and then. That town, those people, the way everything changed when the sun went down. We never did find out who the driver was, and I'm not sure I ever want to know. But if I can offer any advice, it's this. Always trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it probably is. And if you ever find yourself in a place that feels off, don't stay. Just keep moving. Let's not meet again, whoever you were. It was the summer of 1994. I was 16 and staying with my aunt for a few weeks while my parents were away on a trip. She lived in a small town near a park that had a walking trail, a couple of benches, and some wooded areas. Nothing too fancy, but it was a nice place to walk around and clear your head. One evening, around dusk, I decided to take a stroll through the park. I didn't think much of it. I'd done it 100 times before. I grabbed my Walkman, popped in a tape, and set off down the familiar path. The sky was turning that soft purple color it does when the sun's just about gone, and the air was warm but comfortable. As I was walking, I noticed a man sitting on one of the benches near the middle of the trail. He was in his early 30s, I'd guess, dressed in a denim jacket and jeans, though they looked a bit worn. His hair was dark, and he had these intense eyes that just seemed to watch everything. I didn't pay much attention to him at first, just kept walking, letting the music fill my head. But as I passed, I felt something weird, a chill. I didn't look back, but I could feel him watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I brushed it off. It was just my imagination, right? After all, I'd walked this trail before and never had any trouble. But then I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it was someone else walking, but when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him. The guy from the bench. He was following me. I tried to keep walking, maybe a little faster now. My heart rate picked up, but I didn't want to panic. Maybe he was just out for a walk too, right? But then I heard his voice, low and smooth, just loud enough for me to hear. Hey. I didn't respond. Hey, wait up. I didn't stop. I kept my pace steady, focusing ahead. But I could hear his footsteps getting closer, matching my rhythm. Then, I heard a voice again. You're not from around here, are you? I turned my head slightly, just enough to see him. He was still a few feet behind me, his expression unreadable. His smile didn't reach his eyes. No, I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. Just visiting family. There was a beat of silence. You shouldn't be out here alone, he said, and there was something unsettling about the way he said it. It didn't sound like concern. It sounded like a warning. I picked up my pace, trying not to let the panic creep in. But I could hear him closer now. His footsteps were getting louder. And then it hit me. I didn't recognize this guy. He wasn't from the park, wasn't anyone I'd ever seen in town. He had no reason to be following me. And then I realized I was alone in the park with no one else around. I needed to get to the end of the trail. I kept walking faster, almost running now, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked back again, I saw he wasn't far behind. And then he spoke again. I'm not going to hurt you. That was it. The final thing that pushed me over the edge. I ran. I didn't look back. I ran with everything I had, legs burning, breath coming in quick gasps. I just kept pushing, my mind telling me to keep moving, get out of there. I finally hit the end of the trail and bolted for the street. The moment I was on the sidewalk, I turned back. There was no sign of him. I took a deep breath, my heart still racing in my chest. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that maybe I'd just imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. I don't know why. but something told me to head straight back to my aunt's house, lock all the doors, and not look back. I didn't go near that park again. The rest of that night was a blur. I remember walking briskly home, my eyes constantly darting around, half expecting to see him appear out of the shadows. By the time I got to my aunt's house, I was in full-on panic mode. I locked every door, checked every window, and made sure the lights were on in every room. I didn't tell my aunt what had happened. I didn't want to sound paranoid, and part of me still thought I might have been overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I found out I wasn't the only one who'd had a close call in that park. I was scrolling through the local newspaper's website when a headline caught my eye. Man arrested after attempted abduction near park. I froze, reading the article carefully. The details were chilling. It described a man in his 30s, wearing a denim jacket, who had been lurking near the park, approaching women and making them feel uncomfortable. One woman had even reported that he tried to grab her arm before she managed to escape. The article mentioned that he'd been arrested a few days after the incident, though it didn't name the woman who had been the victim of the attempted abduction. I felt sick to my stomach reading it. That man, the one I had brushed off as just creepy, was the same person who had been stalking the park. He'd been watching me. I showed the article to my aunt later that day, and she immediately knew who I was talking about. Apparently, he'd been in and out of trouble for years. He was one of those people everyone kind of knew about, but no one ever really paid attention to, until now. My aunt seemed genuinely concerned, but she tried to comfort me, telling me I was lucky I had gotten away when I did. I didn't feel lucky, though. I felt shaken, like I had narrowly avoided something much worse. Weeks later, I found out more. The man, whose name was Kyle Foster, had been arrested in connection with several similar incidents in neighboring towns. He wasn't just some creepy guy who liked to scare women. He had a long history of harassment and violence. It turned out that he'd been released from a nearby prison not long before the incident at the park. They had caught him after the abduction attempt, and once the police started piecing things together, they realized he had been lurking around multiple parks and trails for weeks, targeting vulnerable women. It felt surreal to know that the man I had brushed off, the man I had walked past thinking he was just some guy in a park, had been actively looking for someone to hurt. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't run that night. Would I have been his next victim? It was a chilling thought, and for a while it felt like I couldn't escape it. To make matters worse, I heard from a friend of mine that a local woman had been attacked just days after I encountered him. She'd been walking her dog on the same trail, and Kyle had approached her in the same manner. Fortunately, she'd fought him off long enough to escape and make it to safety, but it could have been much worse. I tried not to let it consume me, but the anxiety never really went away. Every time I heard a noise outside or saw someone standing in the distance, my heart would race. I couldn't help it. A few months later, Kyle was convicted and sentenced to a long prison term. His name started to fade from the headlines, but I would never forget how close I came to being one of his victims. To this day, I still can't go near that park without getting nervous. I'm more cautious now, always aware of my surroundings. That night, the strange man in the park taught me a hard lesson about trust, intuition, and the reality that not all strangers are harmless. Let's not meet again. I've worked a lot of late-night jobs, but nothing quite like the graveyard shift at a 7-Eleven in Las Vegas. Most people assume the toughest parts are the drunks, the gamblers down on their luck, or the occasional shoplifter. And yeah, those moments aren't great. But they don't compare to one particular night, one that still makes me uneasy when I think about it. It started like any other shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The hours when time feels blurry, and the people who wander and sometimes don't seem quite real. Around 2:30 a.m. I was leaning against the counter, half watching the security feed and half scrolling my phone, when I noticed something unusual. A guy had been standing outside near the gas pumps for a while, probably 20 minutes or so. By itself, that wasn't too weird. Maybe he was waiting for someone, taking a break, or just lost in thought. But something about him unsettled me. He stood too still, just watching the store. I glanced up from the monitor and looked through the glass doors. He was still there. A tall, thin guy in a hoodie, hands tucked into his pockets, not moving. I sighed, figuring I was in for one of those late-night conversations, the kind where someone rambles about government conspiracies or the meaning of life. Standard night shift stuff. But he didn't come in. He just kept watching. Another 10 minutes passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't fear exactly, just a deep unease, like my instincts were picking up on something before my mind could catch up. Then, without warning, he turned and walked away. I let out a breath. Maybe he'd just been lost in thought, or maybe he decided to head somewhere else. Either way, I tried to brush it off and went back to watching the monitors. Still, something about it. And I heard the beep. The chime of the front door opening. I looked up, expecting to see the guy in the hoodie. But it wasn't him. It was a woman. Mid-40s, dressed in an oversized hoodie and sweatpants. She looked normal enough, except for one thing. Her face was pale. Not in the sickly way. In the scared way. She didn't come to the counter. She didn't even acknowledge me. She just walked straight to the back of the store, to the cooler section, and crouched down, half hiding behind the shelves. I frowned. "Are you good?" She didn't answer. I stood there for a second, debating whether I should press her for an answer. Then the door chimed again. I turned, and there he was, the guy in the hoodie. But now he wasn't alone. 2 other men followed behind him. One tall and broad, the other short and wiry. They spread out immediately, moving through the aisles like they had a purpose. I felt my pulse spike. I've dealt with plenty of sketchy people before, but something about this felt wrong. The woman in the back wasn't shopping. She was hiding. And now I had 3 guys who had been lingering outside suddenly coming in together. My gut was screaming at me. I reached under the counter, pretending to adjust something, but really I was checking that the silent alarm button was still there. My manager had warned me to only press it if I was sure something was happening. I wasn't sure yet, but I was getting close. Then, one of the men, the broad one, came up to the counter. He set a single pack of gum down. I rang it up, forcing my voice to stay steady. "That'll be $1.50. He didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile a wolf gives before it pounces. "You here alone?" he asked. I felt my stomach drop. I kept my expression neutral. "Nah, my coworker's in the back." Total lie. I was alone, but I wasn't about to tell him that. His smile didn't fade. Hadn't seen him. I shrugged, trying to look as bored as possible. "They're on break." He tapped his fingers on the counter, still smiling. Then he turned his head slightly and gave a barely noticeable nod to his buddies. That's when I knew. Something bad was about to happen. And I had about 5 seconds to figure out what to do. The wiry guy grabbed the woman's arm. She struggled, trying to pull away as he steered her toward the door. "Help me," she called out, her eyes pleading. "Please don't let them take me." The broad guy shifted closer to me. I gripped the bat and swung, not at him, but at the cigarette rack behind the counter. The metal shelves rattled and crashed, sending packs of cigarettes scattering everywhere. It was just enough of a distraction to make him pause. I took the opportunity and moved. Hopping over the counter, I rushed toward the wiry guy. He let go of the woman just as I swung, and the bat clipped his side. He stumbled back, startled. The woman didn't wait. She took off, running out the door and disappearing into the night. The broad guy recovered quickly, reaching into his pocket. I didn't stay to find out what he had. Turning on my heel, I bolted for the back exit, sprinting through the stockroom. My heart pounded as I pushed through the door and hurried down the alley, ducking behind a dumpster. I listened. A car engine revved, tires screeching as it pulled away. After a few minutes, when everything seemed quiet, I cautiously made my way back toward the store. By then, red and blue lights flashed across the parking lot. The cops had arrived. I told them what had happened. The woman, the men, the commotion inside the store. They checked the security footage, took my statement, and then asked something I wasn't expecting. "Have you ever seen the woman before?" "No." Then one of the cops looked at his partner and said something that made my blood run cold. "Fits the description. That's the 3rd one this month." "The 3rd what?" I asked. The officer hesitated, then sighed. "Women going missing. Usually alone, usually late at night. Witnesses report seeing men like the ones you described, but we haven't been able to track them down." I felt sick. She had gotten away. But for how long? I quit that job 2 days later, and to this day I still wonder if she made it out of Vegas alive. This happened in the late 90s, back when getting stranded somewhere meant you were really stranded. No cell phone, no GPS, just your feet, your nerves, and whoever happened to be around. I was 16, and my little sister, Emily, was 8. We had taken the bus to the mall on a Saturday afternoon, one of those trips where I was supposed to be responsible and watch her while our mom worked. It was a good day. We spent a few hours wandering the stores, eating food court pretzels, and playing in the arcade before heading back to the bus stop just after sunset. That's when I realized my wallet was missing. At first, I thought I had just misplaced it, maybe left it on a table or in a dressing room. But when I checked my pockets, my backpack, nothing. Gone. My stomach sank as I watched our bus pull up. I patted down my jacket one last time, hoping maybe I shoved a few bucks somewhere. No luck. The driver looked at me expectantly, but I had nothing to give him. I lost my money, I stammered. His face was blank. Sorry, kid. No fare, no ride. I looked at Emily. She was already tired, rubbing her eyes. I turned back to the driver. Please, we just need to get home. He shrugged and shut the doors. The bus hissed as it pulled away, leaving us standing under the flickering yellow light of the bus stop. Our house wasn't too far away, maybe an hour's walk if we took the most direct route. But that route included a stretch of road with barely any streetlights, flanked by dense woods. Normally, I wouldn't even think about walking through there at night. But I didn't have a choice. I took Emily's hand. Come on, we'll be fine. She yawned but nodded, trusting me completely. The first part of the walk was okay. The streets were busy near the mall, and there were plenty of cars, neon signs, and people around. But as we got further, the sidewalks got emptier, the lights dimmer. After about 20 minutes, we turned onto the long road that cut through the wooded area, the only way to shave time off our walk. That's when I started feeling uneasy. There was something about walking past woods at night that made you feel exposed. The trees felt too close. Every crunch of leaves, every rustle in the branches made my skin crawl. Emily squeezed my hand tighter. I don't like this, she whispered. Me neither, I admitted. I tried to keep my head down and walk fast, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Not like some supernatural something in the trees nonsense. I mean real danger, like someone was watching us. Then I heard it. A faint sound, like a footstep, just beyond the tree line. I stopped. So did Emily. We stood there, listening. Silence. Had I imagined it? Was it just an animal? Then another sound. Closer. Someone was out there. I held Emily's hand a little tighter, trying to act like everything was fine. But inside, my heart was pounding. That sound. Steady, deliberate footsteps. Wasn't just the wind. It wasn't an animal rustling in the brush. Someone was out there, moving when we moved. I didn't want to worry Emily, but I couldn't ignore it. Stay close, I murmured. She nodded, holding onto my arm. We picked up our pace, walking a little faster. The road stretched ahead of us, quiet and empty. No cars, no houses, just the endless line of trees and cracked pavement. Then another step, a faint crunch of leaves. Something changed. The footsteps weren't just keeping pace with us anymore. They were getting closer. A nervous energy crept over me. Running crossed my mind, but I knew we couldn't. Not with Emily. She was only 8, and if we ran, whoever was out there might run too. That was worse. So instead, I made a choice that felt strange, but was all I could think of. I stopped. Emily tugged on my sleeve, confused. Why are we? I turned toward the trees. My voice was steadier than I expected. I know you're there, I called out. What do you want? Silence. For a long moment, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the distant hum of the highway behind us. Then, another step. This time, onto the pavement. A man stood at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the dim light. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and completely still, watching us. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there. I resisted the instinct to panic. If I reacted, Emily would too. If I ran, he might follow. Instead, I took a slow step back, keeping Emily close. That's when he moved. Not toward us, but around us. Slowly, deliberately, like he was trying to cut us off from the road ahead. I didn't think anymore. I grabbed Emily and ran. She let out a little yelp, but I didn't stop. We sprinted down the road, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could hear footsteps behind us, quick, heavy, chasing us. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Then, headlights. A car was coming up the road. I waved my arms frantically, still running. The driver honked, probably confused, but they slowed down. As the car approached, I risked a glance behind me. The man was gone. The trees swallowed him whole. The car pulled up beside us. An older woman rolled down the window. Are you kids okay? I was gasping for breath, barely able to speak. Someone was following us. I managed. Her face changed instantly. She didn't ask any more questions. Get in. We didn't hesitate. We climbed into the back seat, locking the doors as she pulled away. My hands were still shaking as I looked out the window, scanning the trees, but I never saw him again. She drove us straight home. My mom was furious and terrified when she heard what happened, but by then, it didn't matter. We were safe. I never walked that road at night again, and I still wonder, if that car hadn't come when it did, what would have happened? This happened a few years ago when my buddies and I decided to take a trip to Eastern Europe. We'd heard great things about the vibrant nightlife and affordable prices, so we thought, why not? Our destination was Bucharest, Romania, a city known for its lively bars and clubs. There were 4 of us: Mike, the adventurous one; Jake, always up for a good time; Sam, the cautious planner; and me. We'd been friends since college and had traveled together before, but this trip was supposed to be special, a chance to let loose and enjoy ourselves. Our first few days in Bucharest were amazing. We explored the city's historic sites during the day and hit the bars at night. The locals were friendly, the food was delicious, and the drinks were cheap. Everything was going smoothly until our 3rd night. We started the evening at a popular bar in the old town. The place was packed with tourists and locals alike. As the night went on, we were approached by a promoter who offered us free entry and a complimentary round of drinks at a nearby club. It sounded like a great deal, and we didn't think twice about it. The club was upscale, with dim lighting and loud music. We were escorted to a private table and introduced to a group of women who seemed eager to join us. The drinks kept coming, and before we knew it, we were all pretty intoxicated. That's when things started to get hazy. I remember feeling unusually dizzy and disoriented. Mike, who could usually handle his alcohol, was slumped over the table. Jake and Sam were nowhere to be seen. The women we'd been chatting with had disappeared, and the friendly staff now seemed distant and cold. I tried to stand up, but my legs gave out from under me. The last thing I remember was a group of men approaching our table before everything went black. When I came to, I was lying in a small, dimly lit room. My head was pounding, and I felt nauseous. My wallet, phone, and watch were gone. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea where I was or what had happened to my friends. I stumbled to the door, which was unlocked, and made my way into a narrow hallway. I could hear muffled voices and the thumping bass of music somewhere in the distance. I followed the sound, hoping it would lead me to an exit. As I turned a corner, I bumped into a man in a security uniform. He looked surprised to see me, but quickly grabbed my arm and started speaking rapidly in Romanian. I couldn't understand him, but his tone was aggressive. I tried to explain that I was lost and looking for my friends, but he didn't seem to care. He dragged me through a series of corridors before pushing me into a small office. Behind the desk sat a stern-looking man who eyed me with suspicion. The security guard spoke to him in Romanian, and the man behind the desk nodded before turning his attention to me. "You owe us money," he said in heavily accented English. "What?" "No, there must be some mistake," I protested. "My friends and I were brought here by a promoter. We didn't agree to pay for anything." The man smirked. "Your friends have already settled their debts and left. You, however, still owe us for the drinks and the company of the ladies." I was stunned. It didn't make any sense. We were told the drinks were complimentary, and the women had approached us voluntarily. Something was seriously wrong. "I don't have any money," I said, my voice shaking. My wallet and phone were stolen. The man's expression hardened. "That's unfortunate. Perhaps you can work off your debt another way." Before I could respond, the security guard grabbed me again and led me out of the office. I had no idea what they had planned for me, but I knew I had to find a way out of there and locate my friends before things got even worse. Security guard's grip on my arm tightened as he led me down another dimly lit hallway. My heart was pounding. I knew I was in serious trouble, but I had no idea how I was going to get out of it. We reached a back door, and he shoved me outside into an alley. The cold air hit me like a slap. It was dark, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp further down. I looked around, expecting to see my friends, but the alley was empty. The guard stepped outside behind me and crossed his arms. "You work now," he said in broken English, motioning toward a stack of crates near a van. I shook my head. "I'm not working for you. Just let me go." He didn't like that. His expression darkened, and he took a step toward me. "No money, no phone, no ID," he said. "You don't leave until boss says." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I needed to think. If I fought back, I didn't know if there were more of them nearby. If I ran, I didn't know where to go. But then I heard it, a faint voice in the distance calling my name. My head snapped toward the street lamp. I saw movement, 2 figures standing at the end of the alley. One of them waved. It was Jake, and next to him was Sam. They had made it out. The guard must have sensed my change in energy because he reached for something in his jacket. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted. I sprinted toward my friends, my legs weak but fueled by adrenaline. I heard the guard curse behind me, but he didn't chase me. Maybe because we were now in the open. When I reached Jake and Sam, they grabbed my arms and pulled me toward a cab waiting at the curb. "Get in," Sam yelled. I threw myself into the back seat, barely registering that Mike was already inside. looking dazed. Sam slammed the door, and the driver took off before I even had time to catch my breath. I never used to lock my doors during the day. I grew up in a small town in Louisiana, the kind of place where you knew your neighbors, and strangers stood out. Bad things happened elsewhere. Not here. That changed on a sweltering afternoon in July 2002. I was home alone, folding laundry in the living room, when I heard a knock at the door. Not a polite tap, but a slow, deliberate knocking, the kind that immediately made my stomach tighten. I wasn't expecting anyone. Peeking through the window, I saw a man standing on my porch. He wasn't someone I recognized. Average height, dark eyes, a build that suggested he worked with his hands. He was dressed casually, nothing that immediately set off alarm bells. Still, something about him felt wrong. I hesitated before opening the door. A part of me wanted to pretend I wasn't home, but before I could decide, he knocked again. Louder this time. I swallowed hard and cracked the door just enough to poke my head out. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, but his eyes didn't. "Yeah, sorry to bother you," he said. "My car broke down just up the road. I was hoping I could use your phone." Something about the way he spoke felt off. The words were polite, but there was an edge to them, like he was testing me. I hesitated, glancing toward the road. From where I stood, I couldn't see a car. I don't know why, but my gut screamed at me to lie. "Sorry, I don't have a phone." His smile faltered for half a second before he nodded. "No problem. Just thought I'd ask." I forced a tight smile and pushed the door closed, but before I could latch it, his hand shot out, catching the edge. "Wait," he said, his voice a little too eager now. "Could I at least get a glass of water?" Panic surged through me. I pushed against the door, but he was strong. The gap between us was barely an inch, but I could see the shift in his expression. The polite mask was slipping, replaced by something hungry. That's when I realized he had no reason to be here. There was no broken-down car, no real request. Just a man trying to get inside. And I was alone. My heart slammed against my ribs. The door was still cracked open, his fingers curling around the edge like a vice. I shoved against it with all my weight, but he pushed back. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to force his way inside. Then, a noise. It wasn't loud, just the sound of footsteps in the hallway. But it was enough. He froze, his eyes flicking past me, like he was reassessing the situation. I didn't dare look away, but I knew who it was. My son. He had just come home. The man's grip loosened, just slightly, and in that instant, I slammed the door shut, throwing the deadbolt so fast I nearly jammed it. Silence. For a second, I thought he was still there, standing just inches away. But then, I heard the porch creak, the slow, measured steps of someone retreating. I waited, barely breathing, until I heard nothing but the distant hum of cicadas outside. When I finally got the courage to peek through the window, he was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept going over every moment, every tiny thing that felt off. The way he knocked, the way he tested my responses, the way he smiled, but his eyes never matched. It wasn't until a week later that I saw the news. A composite sketch flashed across the screen, and my stomach dropped. It was him. His name was Derek Todd Lee. They were calling him the Baton Rouge serial killer. He had been breaking into women's homes, attacking them, killing them. And I had almost let him inside. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if my son hadn't come home at that exact moment. I don't like to think about it. I lock my doors now. This happened a few years ago, in the late 1990s. I was in my early 20s, and I had just started my first full-time job at a small marketing firm in a mid-sized town. My commute was fairly straightforward, a 30-minute drive, mostly along back roads. One evening, after a long day of work, I was on my way home, feeling exhausted but relieved the week was finally over. I stopped at a gas station about halfway between the office and my apartment. It wasn't a busy time, around 9:30 p.m., so the station was quiet, the kind of quiet where there's just one other person in the store, and the air smells like the combination of fresh gasoline and stale coffee. I've always been a bit of a night owl, so late-night drives didn't faze me. As I filled my tank, I noticed the cashier was busy chatting with a man who had just walked in. He looked a bit off, maybe in his late 30s, wearing a worn-out jacket and scruffy jeans. But I didn't pay much attention to him. I finished fueling, and I was about to head inside to grab a soda when I heard the man speak to the cashier. "Can you get me the key for the bathroom?" he asked. The cashier nodded, but then he added, "You know, it's kind of late, and I've got to lock up soon." The man gave a little chuckle. "I won't be long," he said, walking toward the back of the store. There was nothing particularly alarming about this exchange. It was just two guys talking, one needing to use the bathroom. But for some reason, I felt an odd unease in the pit of my stomach. I told myself it was just late-night nerves, nothing more. I turned around to head into the store to buy that soda. But that's when I noticed something strange. The man wasn't heading to the bathroom. Instead, he walked toward the exit, and then, as if he had changed his mind, he circled back. That's when I heard the faintest rustling sound from behind me. I turned to see the man standing a few feet away from the counter, staring at me with an unnerving intensity. I took a step back. "Are you all right?" I asked, forcing a calm voice even though every instinct in me was telling me to leave. The man didn't respond at first. Then, after a moment of silence, he just nodded slowly, as if he had just remembered something. "Yeah," he muttered, "just tired." I wasn't convinced. Something in his body language didn't sit right with me. He was pacing, his eyes darting around. I could feel the tension in the air, like something was about to happen. I paid for my soda quickly, turned around, and tried to leave as quickly as possible without being too obvious about it. But when I reached for the door, it wouldn't open. I tugged a few times, assuming maybe it was locked. Then I saw the man step toward the door behind me. I froze. He wasn't touching the door, but he was standing right behind me, so close that I could feel his presence. The chill down my spine turned into a wave of panic. I glanced over at the cashier, who was now watching the interaction closely. I remember the cashier making a subtle gesture with his hand, a small wave that felt like a signal for me to hurry up. I don't know if he had noticed something I hadn't, or if he had seen this man around before. Pushed the door again, harder this time, and it opened. I practically ran out of the gas station, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly got into my car, locked the doors, and sped off. I looked in the rearview mirror as I drove away, half expecting to see the man following me. But there was nothing. It wasn't until I got home and had time to think about it that I realized just how close I had come to a dangerous situation. At night, I didn't sleep much. My mind kept replaying the moment in the gas station, the way the man had stood so close behind me. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was hard to ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few days, I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, the guy had never actually threatened me. He hadn't even said anything threatening. It was just his presence, the odd way he had been acting, that left me uneasy. But then I heard something on the local news that made my blood run cold. It was a report about a string of incidents at various gas stations in the area, somewhere between 2 or 3 other towns nearby. The police were investigating after several women had reported feeling harassed or followed by a man matching the same description. Early 30s, scruffy jacket, unkempt appearance. Some of the women said they felt like they were being watched. Others reported the man trying to get too close, or even following them to their cars. I stared at the TV screen, my heart racing. I quickly grabbed my phone, scrolling through the news website for more details. That's when I saw it. A chilling line at the bottom of the article. Suspect believed to be connected to at least 3 attempted assaults. Suddenly, everything clicked. That strange feeling I had at the gas station, the way the man was lingering just behind me. I wasn't being paranoid. He had been sizing me up, just like he had done with those other women. And if I hadn't acted fast, who knows what might have happened. I couldn't shake the image of his eyes, cold and calculating, as if he was waiting for the right moment. It felt like my close call had been more than just coincidence. I realized how easily things could have turned out differently, and the thought made my stomach churn. A few days later, the police announced they had arrested a suspect who fit the description. The man, whose name was Darren Smith, was linked to multiple reports of attempted assaults at gas stations around the area. They said he had been preying on women late at night, taking advantage of the quiet, low-traffic hours to follow them and make them feel unsafe. His arrest came after a woman had bravely fought him off in a parking lot, and he was eventually apprehended. I felt a strange sense of relief, knowing that Darren Smith had been caught, but at the same time, it made everything feel too real. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I hadn't been aware of what was happening around me, if I had let my guard down for just a second, I might have been the one in the news story. I went to that gas station again about a week later, this time during the day. I didn't need gas, but I wanted to see it for myself, to stand there in the daylight and remind myself how easy it could be to miss the warning signs when you're not paying attention. I walked past the pumps. I looked up at the same spot where I had stood days before. I don't know why, but I expected to see the same man there, waiting. But the gas station was just like it had always been. Ordinary, quiet, safe. I haven't been back at night since, but I've never forgotten that feeling of being watched. Sometimes I still get a little uneasy walking through parking lots or near dark corners. It's been a while now, but I think about it often. How close I came to being another name on the list, another statistic in a police report. And how, in those moments of stillness, when we feel like nothing is wrong, danger can be lurking just out of sight. I don't know who else he might have targeted before being caught, but I'm thankful that I never had to find out the hard way. Let's not meet again, Darren. This happened a few years ago, and to this day, I still don't know what would have happened if I had made a different choice. I was driving home late at night, taking the back roads to my small town like I always did. It was a quiet drive. No other cars, no streetlights, just my high beams cutting through the dark. I liked the silence. It made the long days feel a little less stressful. But that night, something felt off. About halfway home, I rounded a bend and slammed on my brakes. A tree was blocking the road. A big one. Too thick to drive over, too long to go around. I sat there for a second, gripping the wheel. There hadn't been any storms, no strong winds. So how the hell did it end up here? I reached for my phone. No signal. Not surprising. This road barely got service during the day. I could turn around and take the long way home, but that would add another hour to my drive. I sighed, turned on my hazards, and stepped out. The air was cool, the night dead silent. No wind, no crickets. Just the sound of my footsteps on the pavement. I put my hands on the log, trying to push it, but it barely moved. Way too heavy. I was debating whether to try again or just give up when I heard it. A voice. Faint. Coming from the woods to my left. Help me. I froze. It was a man's voice, weak, like he was hurt. Please, help. I turned toward the trees, squinting into the dark. Hello. No response. I swallowed, glancing back at my car. Everything in me said get back inside. But what if someone was actually hurt? What if they'd crashed or gotten lost out here? Help. It was closer now. Too close. That's when I noticed something. The tree. It didn't look like it had just fallen. The edges were too clean, like it had been cut. A bad feeling crept up my spine. I took a step back toward my car. My heart was pounding. Then I heard it. A footstep. Behind me. I turned, and for a split second, in the edge of my headlights, I saw movement. Someone was there. And they weren't calling for help. I didn't think. I bolted for my car, yanking the door open just as I heard rushing footsteps. I slammed the door shut and hit the lock button. For a second, nothing happened. Just me, panting in my seat, my headlights illuminating the empty road. Then, a hand slammed against the driver's side window. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My body locked up, every muscle frozen as I stared at the hand pressed against my window. It was pale, dirty, fingers spread wide. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I fumbled for the ignition, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my keys. The sound of my own breathing filled the car, loud and uneven. Outside, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. I slammed the car into reverse, tires skidding as I backed up fast, my headlights swinging wildly across the trees. I kept expecting to see something, someone, in the beams, but the road was empty. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept reversing until I could make a 3-point turn, tires screeching as I floored it back the way I came. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, my pulse hammering in my ears. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see a figure standing in the road, watching me leave. But there was nothing. By the time I made it back to town, I was shaking so badly I had to pull over. I sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to process what had just happened. Had someone set up that roadblock, trying to make someone stop? Was it a carjacking? A robbery? Something worse? I don't know. But I do know one thing. If I had hesitated even a second longer, I don't think I would have made it out of there. I was 12 the summer my parents sent me to a week-long sleepaway camp deep in the woods of northern Pennsylvania. It was my first time away from home for more than a night, and I was equal parts nervous and excited. The camp itself was pretty basic. Cabins, a mess hall, a lake for swimming, but for some reason, our group was assigned lean-tos instead of actual cabins. If you've never seen one, a lean-to is basically a 3-sided wooden shelter with an open front. They weren't much protection from the elements, and, as I quickly realized, they didn't offer much protection from anything else either. The first few days were fun. We hiked, swam, and sat around the campfire listening to ghost stories that the counselors swore were true. I didn't believe them. I wish I could say the same about what happened next. It was our 4th night there. I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping. At first, I thought it was an animal. There were plenty of deer, and we'd even seen a black bear rummaging through the trash bins behind the mess hall earlier that day. But this was different. The footsteps were too steady, too deliberate. I turned over in my sleeping bag and squinted into the dark. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough of a glow to see the trees lining the clearing. That's when I saw him. A man, standing just beyond the firelight. He wasn't moving, just standing there between the trees, watching. His clothes looked dark and ragged, and even from a distance I could tell something was off. I froze. My brain struggled to make sense of it. Was it a counselor? A late arrival? Someone playing a prank? Then he took a step closer. I jolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hey," I whispered harshly, shaking my friend Matt beside me. He groaned, but didn't wake up. I looked back. The man was still there, still watching. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Click. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the spot where he had been. But he was gone. I stared for what felt like forever, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I had. Maybe my brain was still wired from the ghost stories earlier. I eventually lay back down, but sleep never came. Every rustling leaf, every distant crack of a branch had me wide-eyed and gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light. A shadow. Nothing. I wish that were true. Because by the next night, we'd find out I wasn't imagining things. The next morning, I told the counselors what I saw. I expected them to take it seriously. After all, we were kids sleeping in open shelters in the middle of the woods. But instead, they laughed it off. It was probably a deer, one of them said. Or maybe Bigfoot, another joked, nudging my shoulder. Even my friends didn't believe me. Matt said I must have been dreaming. The other guys started making up stories about the ghost of Camp Wrenwood, turning it into a joke before breakfast was even over. I wanted to let it go. I really did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something real, something dangerous. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual, listening. The fire crackled, the wind moved through the trees, and eventually, the sound of my bunkmates' breathing settled into a slow rhythm as they drifted off to sleep. And then, a branch snapped. I felt my stomach drop. Turned toward the tree line, barely breathing. My flashlight was in my hand, but I hesitated to turn it on. What if I saw him again? Seconds passed. Then a minute. Nothing. I started to think maybe it had just been my imagination. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, closer. My fingers fumbled over the switch of my flashlight. I braced myself, clicked it on, and a scream. Not mine, one of the girls from the other lean-to. A counselor's voice shouted in the distance, and suddenly, the whole camp was awake. I shot up as Matt and the others stirred beside me. We grabbed our flashlights and ran toward the noise, beams of light cutting through the darkness. The girls' lean-to was about 30 yards away, and by the time we got there, they were huddled together, eyes wide with fear. He was here, one of them cried, right outside. A counselor knelt beside them, trying to soothe them, while another swept the woods with a flashlight. Who? They asked gently. The man. My stomach dropped. More counselors arrived, murmuring to each other. One of them clutched a walkie-talkie, speaking in hushed tones. Then, in the distance, sirens. They gathered us all in the mess hall while the adults sorted things out. Everyone was talking at once, trying to make sense of what had happened. The girls insisted they had seen someone moving between the trees, closer than before. One of them had even woken up to find him just a few feet away. The air felt heavy, charged with nervous energy. Whatever had happened, it wasn't just a campfire story anymore. That was when she screamed. An hour later, the head counselor made an announcement. "There's nothing to worry about," she said. "The police are checking the area, but you're all safe. It was probably just a drifter passing through." But she looked nervous. The next morning, they ended camp early. Parents were called. Bags were packed. No real explanation was given, just that they thought it was best to cut the trip short. I didn't find out the truth until weeks later. My mom was watching the news when I walked into the room. I wasn't paying attention until I caught a glimpse of a photo on the screen. A man's face. His mugshot. Escaped from a minimum security prison late last week, the anchor reported. Authorities say he had been on the run for several days before finally being spotted near a campground in northern Pennsylvania. My stomach tightened. They caught him, miles away from where we had been. But for at least one night he had been there, in the woods, watching. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know what would have happened if the girls hadn't woken up. But I do know one thing. That first night, when I saw him, he saw me too. used to work the graveyard shift at a 24-hour grocery store. Most nights were quiet, just stocking shelves, cleaning up spills, and occasionally dealing with a tipsy customer after the bars closed. It wasn't exactly exciting, but it was predictable, except for one night. It was a Tuesday around 2:30 a.m., and the store was nearly empty. My coworker, James, was in the back unloading a shipment, leaving me alone on the floor. The only customer was a man in a hooded jacket, moving slowly through the aisles. Nothing too strange about that. We got plenty of late-night wanderers. But something about him felt off. He wasn't browsing. He wasn't picking anything up. He was just moving, up and down the aisles, slow and deliberate. Every time I looked up from my work, he seemed a little closer. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Still, I decided to walk the store, just to make it seem like I was busy. That's when I realized he wasn't alone. The far end of the store, near the refrigerated section, was another man. Same build, same hooded jacket, standing perfectly still, facing away from me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I made my way to the back room and found James. "Hey man, see those two guys out there?" I asked. He frowned. "Two," I nodded. "They're not shopping, just lurking." James sighed, set down his box cutter, and followed me to the doorway. He peered out for a second, then shook his head. "I only see one guy." I looked. The man near the refrigerators was gone. Maybe I was wrong, I mumbled, but I didn't believe it. James shrugged. "If they're just wandering around, don't worry about it. They'll leave eventually." I tried to shake it off and went back to work, but I couldn't focus. The man in the hood was still there, pacing the aisles, watching. I told myself I'd feel better if I confronted him. Not aggressively, just a casual, "Hey, need help finding something?" I found him in aisle 7. He stood completely still, staring at the shelves. As I walked closer, I noticed his hands were clenched into fists. Something about it made me uneasy. "Hey man, you finding everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice light, trying not to let my nerves show. He didn't move, didn't answer, just stood there, his breathing slow and heavy. A knot tightened in my stomach. "Sir?" Then, without warning, he turned and stepped toward me. I barely had time to react. 1 second, he was standing still. The next, he was charging at me. I stumbled back, throwing my hands up, but he was fast, faster than I expected. His shoulder slammed into me, knocking me hard against the shelves. Boxes tumbled down around us as I tried to regain my footing. "Hey, what the hell?" He didn't say a word, just swung. I ducked. His fist clipped my shoulder, sending a sharp pain down my arm. I turned and ran, heart pounding, my mind racing. Was he robbing the place? High on something? Just insane? I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I sprinted toward the back room, where James was. I made it past the registers, nearly slipping on the freshly mopped floor, when I heard footsteps behind me. He was chasing me. I threw myself at the back room door, slamming it open. "James, call the cops." He barely had time to look up before the guy hit the door behind me. Hard. The metal rattled in its frame as James scrambled for his phone. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a box cutter from the supply shelf, and turned to face the door. Silence. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven. James was already on the phone, his voice sharp with urgency. Then, a slow creak. The door wasn't locked, and he was pushing it open. I gripped the box cutter so tight. "Get the hell out of here, man," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The door opened just a crack, enough for me to see his face, and that's when I realized something. I'd seen him before, not in the store, not around town, but on the news. A few weeks ago, there had been an attack in a parking garage. Random, brutal, without clear motive. The description had been vague, but the hoodie, the build, the empty look in his eyes, I had a feeling. It was him. Before I could say a word, he turned and bolted. By the time the cops arrived, he was long gone. They checked the security footage, took my statement, and assured me they'd look into it. But the way they said it made it clear. They didn't expect much. I never saw him again. But every time I worked the late shift after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might come back. That may be. Next time. I wouldn't be so lucky. The night shift is over, but the darkness lingers. Las Vegas may return to its usual chaos when the sun rises, but for those who have seen what moves in the shadows, the city is never quite the same. Maybe it's just exhaustion playing tricks on the mind. Maybe it's something more. If you ever find yourself working alone at 3 a.m., staring at a security camera feed, or walking past an empty alleyway, remember these stories. Because when the world is quiet and the streets are empty, you're never really alone. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your own horror stories in the comments. And as always, stay safe out there. This has been Survival Horror Ambience. Until next time, keep one eye on the shadows